My parents used to live in a small suburban community near Seattle. They said it was a typical place for ordinary middle-class families, with a pleasant atmosphere overall. Occasionally, you might hear arguments from the couple across the street, but nothing ever escalated. However, tonight they finally told me why they decided to move all the way across the country to New York. Back then, my dad got along well with the next-door neighbors, but the husband, Richard, landed an incredible job opportunity in New York, so they had to move. Dad was upset, but eventually came to terms with it. 3 weeks later, new neighbors moved in. Mom was initially excited to meet them, but her enthusiasm quickly turned into discomfort. From the very first encounter, she noticed something off. The new neighbors always had stiff smiles, their faces pale, almost like they had never been in the sun. Mom said they didn't look like regular people, and something about them just felt wrong. Still, my parents didn't let their unease stop them from being courteous. Once the neighbors settled in, Mom baked cookies, and both she and Dad brought them over to welcome the newcomers. When the neighbors answered the door, they stood side by side with those same pale faces and thin, unchanging smiles. Despite their tired appearance, they invited my parents in. The visit was awkward. My parents tried to make conversation, asking typical questions like where they'd lived before and what kind of work they did, but the answers were vague, with no specifics. The couple didn't initiate any conversation either. They just sat silently side by side on the couch. Even when my parents said they were leaving, the neighbors stayed seated and didn't see them out. It was unsettling, to say the least. Andrew, this was just the beginning. What happened in the following weeks was truly bizarre and terrifying. On the third day after the new neighbors moved in, strange things started happening. Their suitcases were still unpacked, but they immediately began repainting the exterior of their house. The new color scheme? Cream with blue stripes, exactly like my parents' house. When my parents came home from work that day, they were shocked to see the identical house next door, but chose not to say much about it. The next day, Dad went out to mow the lawn, only to see the man next door doing the same thing, wearing the exact same hat as my dad, and using the same brand and model of lawnmower. It was unsettling. When my dad casually brought up the coincidences, like the house painting and matching equipment, the neighbor simply smiled that stiff smile and said nothing. My parents started to keep a closer watch on them. A week later, the neighbors bought a car. And, you guessed it, it was identical to my parents' car. That was the final straw. The next day, Dad decided to confront them, curious about what excuse they'd offer. My parents went together to the neighbor's house. Just like before, the neighbors answered the door standing side by side, their smiles wider than ever. My parents stepped inside and sat down with them, determined to get some answers. The neighbors were silent for a moment, exchanging glances. Then one of them asked, "Are you?" "What's wrong?" My mom grabbed my dad's leg, her face turning bright red with unease. Without saying much more, my parents hurriedly left the house. When they got home, Mom slammed the door shut. They admitted later that they were in what they called a denial phase. They didn't want to believe what was happening, even though deep down, they knew it was real. That night, before going to bed, Dad set up an old camcorder on a corner table facing their bedroom door. From an old box of videotapes, he pulled one out, inserted it into the camcorder, and fast-forwarded it for about an hour. What appeared on the screen was horrifying. The imitation neighbors were standing side by side in front of my parents' bed. This time, there were no stiff smiles on their faces. They looked furious, their features twisted with anger. On the tape, they just stood there, staring at my parents, motionless, for 3 hours straight, until the screen turned to static. They never moved an inch. The next day, while watching the tape, my heart raced with a mix of fear and anger. I grabbed a baseball bat and stormed over to the neighbor's house. When no one answered, I smashed the door open and rushed inside. To my shock, the house was empty. Everything was packed neatly in the living room, ready to be moved. Their BMW. That same day, I reported everything to the police, including the tape. The police launched an investigation, but couldn't find anything. The information the neighbors had used to buy the house and car was stolen from another couple in Arkansas. In the end, we had no choice but to move immediately. My parents decided to move as far away as possible to regain peace of mind. 7 years have passed since then. I never thought I'd talk about it again, but something happened recently. My dad's old friend, Richard, the neighbor he used to be close with, called yesterday. He told me that new neighbors had just moved in next door. The very next day, they repainted their house to look exactly like his. When you're done, just bury her under the house. Toss in your dirty clothes too. Pour the concrete, finish the floor, build the house. Who's going to find her? You hand over the house according to the contract. The bus jolted to a stop, pulling me from my thoughts. I had reached my destination. The man next to me stood up, patting my shoulder as he exited. I took a step back instinctively, a sudden memory flashing in my mind. I was less than 6 years old, playing hide and seek with friends. I had hidden under the crawl space of the front porch. In the dirt beside me, I noticed half a boot sticking out, the same boots I'm wearing now, the same ones I found under the crawl space of every house in the community. Identical, every time. You've probably heard of weighted blankets. They were originally designed to help people with autism, anxiety, and insomnia find comfort. Over time, they became popular in many households because they are genuinely comfortable. For comfort, people are willing to pay almost any price. For me, comfort was elusive. 2 years ago, my wife and kids disappeared. I sold our suburban house and moved into a small, cheap apartment near work. I attended every therapy session recommended by the police and social workers. Despite their help and prescribed medication, I barely managed to sleep more than 1 or 2 hours a night. But I kept telling myself it was okay. The worst was behind me. Grief and shock have expiration dates, or so they say. To help myself, I decided to try a weighted blanket. I ordered a large one from Amazon, the size of my double bed, even though I slept in it alone. As a Prime member, I expected it to arrive in 2 days, but it took several. The box that finally arrived looked battered, misshapen, filthy, and tied with frayed twine. It even had what appeared to be burn marks. It looked more like a prop from a low-budget action movie than a delivery. Still, I dragged it inside. It's a gift from the family farm, I muttered to myself, trying to inject some humor. The contents, once opened, seemed fine. A plush blue microfiber blanket with tight stitching and an appropriate weight. I left it atop my duvet and went about my day. That night, I decided to give it a try. Sliding under the cold sheets, I pulled the weighted blanket over me. The weight was immediately noticeable, but surprisingly comforting. For the first time in months, I fell asleep imagining the warmth of my children beside me and the familiar curve of my wife's body behind me. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. I had overslept. For weeks, the blanket worked wonders, but a faint chemical smell began to grow stronger, lingering on my skin even after showers. Eventually, the odor became unbearable. My coworkers noticed, even suggesting I check my washing machine for a dead mouse. I took the blanket to 6 different dry cleaners before one finally explained the problem. The filling wasn't what it seemed. Armed with a funnel and bucket, I followed the instructions they gave me. Cutting a small seam, I waited for the beads to pour out, but instead, a single metal ring clinked against the bucket. It was a wedding ring, still attached to a piece of flesh. My mind reeled as I recognized the fingerprint engraved on it. The inscription inside the ring was obscured, but I didn't need to read it, I already knew. Panicked, I yanked at the blanket, spilling its contents. It wasn't beads or fabric, it was fragmented remains. Dry, clumped flesh. Tiny bones. Among the horrifying debris, I found my daughter's Hello Kitty Band-Aid and a filling from my son's tooth. For 2 months, I had been sleeping under the weight of my family's remains. The police did their best, but the trail led nowhere. The package had been delivered by an unmarked van, caught briefly on security cameras, and Amazon's records showed the blanket was new when shipped. Their lawyers assured me it was a tragic anomaly and promptly issued a refund, even offering store credit. I declined. I canceled my Prime membership, threw away my smart devices, and even got rid of my smartphone. I didn't want anything to do with them again. After all, how else could someone have found the bodies? There's no other reasonable explanation.